In this video, I will explain how to calculate the GDP deflator. Now, the GDP deflator is a very simple calculation. It's simply the nominal GDP in a given year divided by the real GDP in that same year multiplied by 100. So the GDP deflator is really just used to measure whether prices have increased in a current year relative to some base year. So if we calculate the GDP deflator and it comes out to a number greater than 100, it means that prices have risen since the base year. And it's worth noting that the GDP deflator is always equal to 100 in the base year. So let's check out an example of how to actually calculate the GDP deflator. Consider this table where we have 3 years, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Let's assume that we're using 2023 as the base year. So for each year, we've listed the nominal GDP along with the real GDP. So to calculate the GDP deflator for 2023, all we would do is take the nominal GDP of 100,000 and divide it by the real GDP of 100,000 and then multiply by 100. So here's what we get when we do that. So when we do that, we end up with a value of 100. And as we mentioned earlier, the GDP deflator is always equal to 100 in the base year. And the reason for that is because the nominal GDP and the real GDP for the base year will always be the same. So this fraction right here will just always be equal to 1. So 1 times 100 is just 100. Now let's calculate the GDP deflator for 2024. So we'll take the nominal GDP of 130,000, we'll divide it by the real GDP of 120,000, and then multiply that by 100. So when we do that, we end up with a value of 108.33. So because this number is greater than 100, it means that prices must have risen in 2024 compared to our base year of 2023. Now lastly, let's calculate the GDP deflator for 2025. So to do that, all we do is take the nominal GDP of 140,000, divide it by the real GDP of 125,000, and then multiply by 100. So when we perform that calculation, we end up with a GDP deflator value of 112. So again, because this number is greater than 100, it means that prices in 2025 have risen compared to 2023, the base year. Now, the GDP deflator by itself isn't that interesting of a metric, but where it's really useful is in calculating the inflation rate. And here's the formula we use to calculate that. We say that the inflation rate in a given year is equal to the current GDP deflator, which I've just abbreviated as GD, minus the previous year's GDP deflator, divided by the previous year's GDP deflator. So for example, if we consider 2024, to calculate the inflation rate, all we have to do is take the current GDP deflator minus the previous year's GDP deflator and then divide by the previous year of 100. So here's what we get when we do that. So when we do that, we get 8.33%. So that's the inflation rate for 2024. So that tells us that in 2024, in this particular economy, the prices rose by an average of about 8.33% compared to our previous year of 2023. Now, we can use the exact same formula to calculate the inflation rate for 2025. So we'll take the current GDP deflator of 112, we'll subtract the previous year's GDP deflator of 108.33, and then we'll divide by this previous GDP deflator of 108.33. So when we do that, we get 3.39%. So that tells us that the inflation rate in 2025 was 3.39%. In other words, prices rose by about 3.39% compared to the prices from 2024. So that was just a quick example of how to calculate the GDP deflator along with how to use it to calculate the inflation rate.